Guys, welcome back. In the last video, we took an example of thermometer to illustrate when signal gets transposed from one form to another form. The final signal is not the same as initial signal, but it represents some form of initial signal in other form, but both initial and final signals are not same. We showed that in the last video. Guys, this video is going to be very exciting and we will use the last video's conclusion to show how we see the world. We will show some inconsistencies in the model of how we see. That there are holes in the model that neuroscientists have come up with. We will also talk about philosophical model too and issues with the philosophical model also. However, what is interesting is to understand what the word perception means, as understanding the definition of the word perception will yield to the finding of the purpose of human life. Guys, let's look at the picture on this slide. This is the side view of a human face. Let's go through as to how we see the world through our eyes. On the left side, we have eyes. Here are our eyes. That is one of the eye. From the outside world, the light rays enter into our eyes and go through the lens, and the light rays hit the back of our eyes. At the back of our eyes, we have rod and cone cells. What does this rod and cone cells do? They don't see the world that we see. They just convert the light signal to electrochemical signal, and this signal gets fed to our optic nerve. This is similar to our thermometer that takes the temperature signal and converts it into the electrical signal. Once the optic nerve gets electrochemical signal, it passes from one neuron to another neuron, and there are thousands of neurons in this pathway of the signal. Between each of these neurons, the electrical signal gets converted to chemical signal in the synapse. That is the gap between neurons. If there is enough powerful chemical signal, the next neuron gets fired and it gets converted to electrical signal. The signal gets converted between electrical and chemical signal between each neuron, and as there are thousands of neurons in the pathway, signal gets converted thousands of times. However, where does this pathway end? The pathway ends into the visual cortex. This visual cortex is at the back of our head. The visual cortex creates the picture of what we see. That is how neuroscientists believe we see the picture that brain has created. This is the model neuroscientists use to explain how we see, or how the picture gets created by visual cortex. Now understand, folks, this is important. What you see is what your brain has created and not what is outside. The perception that brain has created is not some hollow perception. For an example, what you see like a solid table object, the solidity of the table, the color of the table, the dimensions of the table, or the space around the table that you see is all created by visual cortex and your brain. The proof that your brain creates this perception can be further provided by examining our dreams. Even when our eyes are closed, our brain creates a picture from our dreams. What this proves is that what we see is not what our eyes have created, but the perception that has been created by our brain. What we see is just one form of representation of the world and not the actual world. Let's understand bat's view of how the bat perceives the world through its sonar signals. The bat detects the environment from sonar waves as their eyes are weak and they must be creating the internal representation of the surrounding area in their brain. However, internal representation is not the same as external representation for a bat. But surely there is a relationship between internal and external representations. Similarly, for us, our eyes and brain creates internal representation that we know only, but we do not know the actual nature of the real world. Our eyes are just one instrument that converts light signal to electrochemical signal. Now let's compare of what we see to the last video where temperature signal from thermometer gets transposed to electrical and digital signal and gets printed on paper in printer room. What we concluded is that the original signal of the temperature and what gets printed on paper are not same but represents temperature in different format, but both formats are not same. Similarly, what you see is interpretation of nerve signals by visual cortex and not what is in the outside world. We do not know what is in the outside world. That is one of the problem with the neuroscientist's model. There are additional issues with the neuroscientist's viewpoint. Let's go through a couple of objections to the neuroscientist's model that our brain creates perception for us. One of the objections with the neuroscientist model is that what we see is inside our brain, but what we see the world is outside of the brain, like table, chair, etc. that are in our living room. That is true for our body too, that what our brain perceives, our body is inside our brain, but what we see that body, that is our arms, our legs, etc. are outside our brain. An object cannot be inside and outside of another object at the same time. Another objection to this model that brain creates perception is that as we perceive inside our brain, the whole world is inside our brain, and it is perception or the idea that we see. Thus, what we know is only what our brain has perceived, and we truly cannot prove the existence of outside world objects as what we perceive is inside our brain. There are more objections to the neuroscientist model of how we see, and thus philosophers believe that it is not our brain that creates the picture, that is our perception, but our mind creates the picture of what we see. There are issues with this model too. But at this point, we are not interested in debating whether mind creates the picture or brain creates the picture. What we are interested is the picture itself. Now let's call that picture a perception. Philosophers use the word idea to describe the picture that brain/mind creates. Bertrand Russell calls it appearances. I like to use the word perception. The perception just does not consist of the picture, but additionally what we hear, our sense of smell, our sense of touch, and all other inputs, and additionally our emotions and thoughts also. Understanding of this word perception is very important to understand the purpose of life. Let us define the word perception clearly. When we are conscious, our brain/mind creates this perception. Whatever we know by our conscious brain is perception. When a doctor gives us anesthesia, we become unconscious and we do not have this perception. Guys, we will further define this perception in next video and come up with the purpose of life. Regarding clarifying who creates the perception, whether is it mind or brain or something else, we will create the model of who we are later to resolve the conflicts in the model. But first, we need to find the purpose of life and understanding the definition of the perception is very important. Perception is an output of the brain when we are conscious. Guys, in the next video, we'll talk about perception more and we will come up with the purpose of life in next video. Guys, thank you for listening and I will see you in next video.